In this unit of the course, we're looking at some of the classic arguments for God's existence. We've spent a good bit of time now on the cosmological argument for God's existence. Let's turn now to the teleological argument, or the argument from design, another of the classic arguments for the existence of God. As Bonjour and Baker point out in their commentary, this is another a posteriori argument. I've touched on this distinction before between a priori and a posteriori reasoning or argumentation. A priori means independent of experience or not justified by experience. As I've said before, some of our knowledge seems to be a priori, not justified by any empirical procedure, such as knowledge in math, knowledge in logic. And of course, a lot of our knowledge is based on observation, is based on experience, is based on empirical evidence. And the cosmological argument is a posteriori in the sense that it begins from the observation that we find ourselves in a cosmos. We find ourselves in a universe, in a physical reality. The teleological argument also begins from a certain observation, namely that when we look around the universe, or when we look around the natural world in which we find ourselves, we also observe that there's a lot of organization, there's a lot of arrangement, there's a lot of structure. And it's an old inference in the history of philosophy that therefore, in some sense, mind must be responsible for the arrangement, the organization, the structure that we find. So this is another a posteriori argument. It begins from a certain truth of observation, a certain fact of observation. It's a posteriori in that sense. The Greeks were very much struck by this fact that when we look around the natural world, what we find is an awful lot of organization, arrangement, structure. So that's one reason that this is an old argument in the history of philosophy, and for a long time it's gone by this name, the teleological argument. I've touched on this term teleological before, or at least the term telos. When we looked at Aristotle's fourfold connection of causation, we mentioned this notion of a final cause. The Greek term is telos. A final cause, a purpose, a goal, an end, an aim. It seems like the natural world is organized around purposes. Lots of examples that you can think of, I'm sure. We already touched in an earlier context on the concept of an efficient cause. An efficient cause is that which makes. So in the natural world, we certainly see lots of examples of that, to say nothing of human beings and all the different kinds of things that they make, but even other animals. Birds build nests, beavers build dams, spiders spin webs. So we see an awful lot of purposive behavior, certainly in the animal kingdom. And even going down lower than animals, even in plants, of course, we see an awful lot of purposive arrangement. What I mean by purposive arrangement is that the way living things are structured, the way that they're organized, aims at some end. The organization serves some purpose, brings about some end, brings about some goal, strives to fulfill some purpose. So there's a reason that trees, for example, send their roots down rather than up. They send the roots down for the sake of collecting water, the sake of collecting nutrients from the soil. That's a kind of purposive behavior even in the lives of plants. Or it's an apparent purposive behavior anyway. I don't want to beg the question here as to whether the argument is sound, but it certainly appears to be purposive. It certainly seems like there's a purpose. There's a goal that explains why trees send the roots down rather than up. And many other structures of plants also seem to be purposive in nature. Oftentimes, the leaves are for the sake of protecting the fruit, say, for example. That's a kind of purposive arrangement of things. Certainly see lots of purposive structure in the animal kingdom as well. Think, for example, of the role that a skunk's spray plays in keeping skunks alive. I don't know if you've ever seen a skunk run, but on one occasion I saw a skunk run, and it struck me that they're extremely slow. If they had to evade predators by running, they would not have survived. Well, because they're extremely slow, they have a defense mechanism that protects them against much faster predators. So lots of examples that you can think of, I'm sure, in the natural world, in plants, animals. We see an awful lot of organization, an awful lot of structure. And it's an old inference that there must be a mind that is responsible for this structure. So this is an old idea in philosophy. It goes back to the Greeks. The Greeks were very much struck by this fact that what we find when we look around is organized. It does have structure. It does have arrangement. That was very characteristic of Greek thinking to notice that. We've touched on this question, this profound metaphysical question: why is there anything rather than nothing? Well, that question has become a focus more in, I would say that was more of a focus in early modern philosophy. Philosophers like Leibniz wrote a lot about that question, but that's been a preoccupation more of early modern philosophy. When you go back to the Greeks, that isn't really so much the central metaphysical question. Why is there anything rather than nothing? The Greeks pretty much took it that there had always been something. That wasn't what intrigued them so much. But what intrigued them very much was that there's order rather than chaos. Why should that be the case? Why should it be the case that what we find when we look around at the physical reality in which we find ourselves, why should it be the case that what we find is ordered, is organized, is arranged, has structure, has organization of parts, seeming to serve some end, seeming to strive to realize some goal? This is characteristic of what we find. And this was very characteristic of Greek thought. Even in Greek mythology, even before the beginnings of philosophy, it was a common theme in Greek mythology that for a long time there had been chaos. And then at a point, the early Greek divinities, the early Greek gods, brought order to what had for a long time just been chaos. And that carries over from Greek mythology into philosophy. That carries over into the beginnings of philosophy in ancient Greece. An awful lot of early Greek philosophers focus on this issue to do with the transition from chaos to order, and really see that as the beginning of the cosmos, to use what is also a Greek term, the Greek term cosmos. The literal sense of it, we've seen this term in connection with the cosmological argument, right? Well, the Greeks' word for the universe, their word was cosmos, and the literal sense of that is order. So the Greeks were very much struck by the fact that what we find in the universe around us does have order. That was the really intriguing thing to them. Why should there be order rather than chaos? There could have been just chaos. That was one of the logical possibilities. Thinking just in terms of the logical possibilities, there were many other possible worlds. The universe could have been just homogeneous, undifferentiated stuff, infinitely extended, with no organization to it at all. That was one of the logical possibilities. The universe could have been nothing but green jello. No complexity to it, no structure, no organization, no arrangement, just infinitely extended green jello. That was one of the possibilities. Not even any fruit. That would have been rough. That was one of the logical possibilities, but that's not what we find. What we find is a cosmos. What we find is something that has order, something that has arrangement, organization. And the Greeks were very much struck by this, and we saw a little bit of this in Aristotle's emphasis on the idea of a final cause. The telos, the goal, is in some sense the most important of the four causes that he identifies. I gave this example last time. Why is the man walking? For the sake of health. for the sake of health. The health doesn't exist yet, and yet it explains the activity. So many activities do seem to be purposive like that, not only activities in the domain of human affairs like that example, but so much activity in the animal world, and even, if we may call it activity, if that even is the right term to use, and even in the lives of plants. The characteristic changes that plants go through seem to serve some goal, seem to serve some end. So it's an old idea in the history of philosophy. We have some selections from the writings of the 18th century British philosopher William Paley. We have some selections from his work of 1802, Natural Theology. And this is one of the classic statements of the argument in relatively recent times. In our selections, Paley writes, arrangement, disposition of parts, subserviency of means to end, relation of instruments to use, imply the presence of mind. And here again, this is an old argument in the history of philosophy. It goes back a long, long way. It goes back many centuries before Christianity, before the Judeo-Christian conception of God came to have the prominent place in philosophy that it did. Even before that, here, even among the pre-Socratic philosophers, even in this very early stage of Greek philosophy, before Plato and Socrates, Anaxagoras believed, for example, that the fundamental principle of the universe, is mind. Argued using this Greek term nous, and nu, omicron, upsilon, sigma, nous. Used this Greek term for mind and said that was the fundamental principle at work in the universe. So that was, I've touched on other pre-Socratic philosophers who argued that the fundamental principle at work in the universe was some physical principle, like the principle of water in the case of Thales, or the principle of air in the case of Anaximenes, or the principle of fire in the case of Heraclitus. They thought some principle like that was the steering, the guiding, the organizing principle in the natural world, the governing principle in the universe. But another of the pre-Socratic philosophers, Anaxagoras, argued that actually the fundamental principle at work in the universe is mind. So this is an old idea in philosophy. A kind of divine mind, a kind of cosmic mind, was responsible for the structure in the universe. And then in the case of Plato, Plato argued that there was a divine craftsman. The Greek term is demiurge, or demiurgos, oftentimes translated into English as demiurge. A divine artisan, a divine craftsman, who, again, took what had been a chaos and imposed order on it. So this is an old idea in philosophy. Here again, it goes back in Greek culture even further than the beginnings of philosophy. It was an old idea in Greek culture. So it's an old idea. Paley gives one of the classic statements of it in relatively recent times, in modern times. The fact that we find arrangement of parts that are disposed in such a way as to serve certain ends, as to bring about certain goals, implies the presence of mind. So this is the argument from design, or the teleological argument. Teleology means the study of purposes, again from this Greek term telos, which means purpose, goal, aim, end, what in the context of Aristotle's fourfold analysis of causation I called the final cause. The final cause is always a purpose, a goal, an aim, an end. I gave the example earlier of the sculpture being the purpose of the sculptor's activity. Why does the sculptor take marble and hammer and chisel and engage in the activity that he does for the sake of a sculpture? And here again, in the domain of human activity, obviously this is non-controversial. Obviously that human activity is purposive, is uncontroversial. I think anyone would be willing to stipulate that. But in relatively recent times, it is a somewhat more controversial question. Is the behavior of physical world below the level of human activity. Is the structure, the arrangement, the organization that we find in the natural world, is it correctly described as expressing purpose or as aiming at purposes? In relatively recent times, after the rise and the influence of evolutionary biology, the broadly Darwinian view of things, of course, it's a more controversial claim to say that the natural world is organized around purposes. That's not really, of course, the picture of the Darwinian approach to the natural world, right, where blind, random physical forces just generated in a kind of unthinking way, in a way that had nothing to do with purpose, in a way that was just random, generated complexity, structure, order. That's, of course, the broadly Darwinian perspective. Paley is writing, it's important to note here, Paley is writing before Darwin. Natural Theology, again, is a work of 1802. Paley was an 18th century British philosopher, somewhat earlier than the 19th century scientist Charles Darwin. And of course, the argument from design, or the teleological argument, has been criticized from the Darwinian point of view. And we'll touch on one such criticism when we turn to our selections from 20th century American biologist Stephen Jay Gould. But I think if you read the selections from Paley that we have carefully and closely and critically, I think what you'll find is that he anticipated many of the arguments in Darwin. He anticipated many of the arguments in evolutionary biology, with its emphasis on natural selection and survival of the fittest, and here again, blind, unthinking, random physical forces just by accident generating complexity. That broad perspective of things. Paley's already aware of that line of thought even before it finds expression in Darwin's work on natural selection. We see in the selections that we have that Paley anticipates a number of the objections to the argument from design that would be developed later, given the rise and importance and influence of evolutionary biology. So it's more controversial in relatively recent times to say that the natural world is organized around purposes. Here again, that human activity is purposive. That's uncontroversial. But since Darwin, of course, a lot of thinkers, a lot of people in general would just say that even though human activity is purposive, clearly aims at goals, to think that matter, to think that the physical world is organized around purposes, involves a kind of projection onto the natural world of habits of thought that are really distinctive to human activity, and we have a tendency to project onto the world patterns that are familiar from our own experience, but the natural world isn't really organized around purposes, at least not in the sense that the purposes or the goals or the apparent goals, here again I don't want to beg the question as to whether the argument is sound, but the apparent goals served by the structures in the natural world don't imply any design. They are just a consequence of the evolutionary process. Every generation, a certain number of phenotypes are thrown up. A certain number of phenotypes are generated by the random process of genetic variation, the random process of genetic mutation. Some of the phenotypes end up being advantageous, confer some survival advantage. Many of the phenotypes do not in any given generation. Many of the traits associated with genetic variation, genetic mutation in any given generation, many of those traits end up not conferring any fitness advantage or even being disadvantageous, and so those members of the generation don't live long enough to reproduce. The ones that have traits that confer some survival advantage, they of course live long enough to reproduce, and so those genetically based traits get passed on. I'm sure you're all familiar with the basic Darwinian picture of things. And on that perspective, the natural world is not really organized around purposes. or in any case, the apparently purposive structures don't imply any designing mind. That would be, of course, the opposed view. But let's think about the way that Paley makes the argument, and then we'll turn to Stephen Jay Gould's criticisms a little bit later. Paley talks about the experience of walking on the moors, walking out on the heath in the English countryside, and happening upon a watch, something that is obviously a product of intelligent design. That's, here again, uncontroversial. We know that watches are made by watchmakers. We know that watches are made by human beings, and human beings are intelligent. And they are applying their intellect when they devise things, when they craft things. Obviously, all that's uncontroversial. Paley says, if you happened upon a watch, you would infer right away that the watch was a product of intelligent design. He says, if you and a companion were walking on the moors, walking out on the heath, and you happened upon a stone, if you were to ask your companion, how did that come to be here? A perfectly good answer would be, well, for all I know, it's pretty much always been there. It was just thrown together by random physical forces. Gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, so forth and so on. Blind physical forces just threw together a rock. Okay, that would be a plausible explanation for that. But now suppose you stumble upon a watch. That answer would not be plausible in the case of a watch. Blind physical forces like gravity and the laws of thermodynamics just threw together something as complex as a watch? No, that would not be a plausible answer in the case of a watch. So Paley begins with that observation, and then he draws an analogy between that complex item, a watch, which clearly is purposive. It's organized around a certain purpose, namely to tell time. And he says, think of so many of the structures, the organic structures in the natural world that we did not invent. They are far more complex than the kinds of things that we could ever invent, right? He gives the example of an eye. Could a watch be a product of an intelligent design? Which here again is uncontroversial. Nobody disputes that. And an eye, which is far more complex than a watch, not be? And here again, that an eye is far more complex than a watch, that's uncontroversial as well. Think of how much more complex an eye is than anything that human beings could invent. Think of all of the millions of cells that have to interact to produce a visual image, to produce an image in the visual cortex. Here's representation of many of the parts of the eye: retina, retinal blood vessels, optic nerve cup, macula, sclera, the pupil, the cornea. All these parts have to work together in such a complex way, and this is just at a relatively high level of organization, right? Think of all the ways that the millions of cells have to interact to perform the function that the eye performs. Far more complex than anything that human beings could invent. And here again, it's uncontroversial that the watch is a product of intelligent design. We know that watches are made by watchmakers. How could something far more complex than a watch not be a product of intelligent design? That is Paley's inference, and here again, it has seemed to many people, to many philosophers, a natural inference. It's an old inference in the history of philosophy. It seems like there are purposes in nature. When you look at the structures of things, when you look at how they're organized, the organization always serves some goal, always serves some purpose. Think about the structure of a heart, say, for example. It seems like it is the purpose of the heart to pump blood. It seems like there are purposes in the natural world. Think of the ways that all the parts of a heart have to interact, have to function in order to bring about the goal of pumping blood. The aorta, the coronary artery, coronary arteries. Think of the way that all the parts have to work together to bring about the end of pumping blood. And suppose a Martian scientist came here and you were trying to explain to him, suppose that physically Martian scientist is quite different from us, doesn't have the same organs, is physically quite different. And so he's studying the human body and he's studying the heart. Do you think that you could give any very good explanation? Suppose he asks, why is this organ structured the way that it is? Do you think that you could give any very satisfactory explanation without making any reference to what the heart does, to the heart's function, to the heart's purpose of pumping blood? Doesn't seem like you could. So it seems like there are purposes in the natural world, in the physical world. Here again, human behavior is obviously purposive, but human beings didn't invent the human heart. And yet it seems like there is a purposive arrangement involved in the heart's bringing about the end that it does, serving the function that it does within the larger context of the body. Now, of course, a purpose, it's an old idea that a purpose is something that is had in a mind. Matter itself can't have, at the most basic level, matter can't have purpose, and yet matter comes to be organized around so many purposes in the natural world, or at least it seems to. And so it's an old inference that mind must in some sense be responsible for the order, for the organization that we find in the natural world. Okay, so let me draw on another text, Louis Poyman's Philosophy of Religion, to give a summary of the argument. I think Poyman does a good job of summarizing the basic threads in the argument, identifying the basic elements. There have been lots of versions of it. Paley writes very well, but if we were to just state makes his points very persuasively, but if we were to just boil it down to its logical essentials and try to state the argument very concisely, a little bit more concisely than what we have in Paley's extended discussion here, we might follow Poyman's breakdown of it. Human artifacts are products of intelligent design, or products of purpose. Here again, no one would dispute the truth of that premise. Uncontroversial. Watches are made by watchmakers. We know where watches come from. They come from watchmakers. The universe resembles these human artifacts. Okay, I suppose that's somewhat more controversial, but here again, even that shouldn't be too controversial, I wouldn't think, because of course form follows function. Art imitates nature, right? So the structure of a camera lens, say for example, is very similar to the structure of the human eye. Well, of course, that's because human beings invented cameras. Human beings invented camera lenses. So no surprise there. It shouldn't really be a surprise that there is the resemblance between human artifacts and the universe. So it seems like that premise should be uncontroversial as well. And then the first inference would be, therefore, the universe is probably a product of intelligent design. The universe is probably a product of purpose as well, just as human artifacts are. Human artifacts are unquestionably, uncontroversially, a product of purpose. The universe resembles these artifacts, therefore the universe is probably a product of purpose, a product of a designing mind, of an intelligence. That would be the first inference, and then the conclusion of that first inference in turn becomes a further premise. So I'm using that inference to the first conclusion, that inference to statement 3 from the first two premises, as a further premise in turn that is going to be used to justify the ultimate inference, the ultimate conclusion, the one presented in statement 5. Premise 4, the universe is vastly more complex and gigantic than a human artifact. Okay. And here again, uncontroversial. Therefore, conclusion, so this is the ultimate inference of the argument, there probably is a powerful and vastly intelligent designer who designed the universe. Okay. So it seems like all the premises 1 through 4, are uncontroversial. Well, premise 3 would be controversial. But it has seemed a natural inference to many people. So this would be at least the first 2 premises uncontroversial, the 4th premise uncontroversial. The inference, however, of course, has been challenged, has been controversial. Many philosophers think there's a better explanation for these resemblances. And when it comes to this analogy between human artifacts on the one side and the universe on the other side, many philosophers have argued this is not a good analogy, including the skeptical philosopher we talked about last time, David Hume. But that is the argument from design. One way that Paley puts the point is to say there cannot be design without a designer, contrivance without a contriver, order without choice, arrangement without anything capable of arranging. So I said a moment ago that purposes are something that are found in minds. Minds are intentional. Minds direct activity in a way that aims at the fulfillment of some purpose. This is sometimes called intentionality, or this trait about the human mind that it is intentional oftentimes in its activity, in its employment, striving to bring about some goal, some end. Purposes are had in minds. If there are purposes in the natural world, here again matter is unthinking, if there are purposes in the arrangement of matter into all the complex forms that we find in the universe, then it's an old inference that there must be a mind in which all those purposes were had. And it's that mind, it's that intelligence that is the source of the structure, organization, arrangement, contrivance, design that we find, purposive arrangement of parts that we find in the natural world. So Paley puts the point by saying there cannot be design without a designer, contrivance without a contriver, order without choice, arrangement without anything capable of arranging, subserviency in relation to a purpose without that which could intend a purpose. So again, purposes are intentional in nature, and intentionality is a trait of the human mind. Well, let me put the point this way, is a trait of minds. It's not only a trait of the human mind, obviously, animal minds. Animal psychology is oftentimes purposive in nature as well, and if there is a divine mind, as one infers in this argument, then the inference would be that it is purposive in nature as well. It is intentional in nature as well. It aims to use reason to bring about certain goals, certain ends. So means suitable to an end, and executing their office and accomplishing that end, without the end ever having been contemplated, or the means accommodated to it. So that's Paley's way of putting the point. Of course, as I said a moment ago, Paley anticipates many of the criticisms of this argument that we would today associate with the Darwinian perspective on things, the evolutionary biological perspective on things. Even though he's writing some years before Darwin, Paley anticipates many of the Darwinian arguments that you might find in the debate over intelligent design. So here again, the other perspective is broadly that blind, random physical forces just by chance threw together complex, organized structures, and there's no intelligence, there's no design, there's no mind, there's no intellect behind the structure, the organization, the arrangement that we find. It's actually better explained by this blind, random process that I described a moment ago. I won't run through it again. I think you understand. You're probably all acquainted with the basic Darwinian picture of how this works. But that would be the opposed point of view. Paley argues that it's not plausible that blind, random, unthinking physical forces like gravity and the laws of motion, the laws of hydraulics, the laws of electromagnetism, the laws of thermodynamics, all the kinds of causal laws that the physical sciences discover, it is not plausible that these blind forces threw together complexity. He offers this analogy. He gives the analogy of a mill. So again, walking in the English countryside, as is the setting for our selections from Paley's Natural Theology. In the English countryside, especially in his day, the 18th century, there would have been a lot of mills. So corn, wheat, they were ground into flour. There was a millstone inside the mill, and of course the millstone was turned by an axle that was connected to a water wheel. So this would have been a common sight in the countryside in Paley's day. And he offers this analogy. You know, the current of the river, of course, provides the raw physical force by which the corn is ground into flour, or the wheat is ground into flour. The raw, unthinking, brute physical force of the current of the river, yes, provides the mechanism with the drive, with the energy that it needs to perform that task. But the blind, unthinking physical force would not itself, of course, bring about any purpose, bring about any purposive goal, such as turning corn or wheat into flour. That wouldn't just happen by a blind random application of physical force, such as the current of a river. It has to be applied through some contrivance, of course, which is the mill, the complicated system of water wheel and axle and gears and millstone and grindstone, all these things that go into the contrivance of a mill. Blind random physical forces like the current of a river, or here again gravity, or the laws of motion, or the laws of electromagnetism, or the laws of thermodynamics, or the laws of hydraulics, they wouldn't throw together something as complex and something as organized as a mill, something arranged for the sake of bringing about a purpose. None of those random physical forces would bring something that complex about. So here again, Paley argues from this kind of an analogy. We might possibly say, but with great latitude of expression, that a stream of water ground corn. Yeah, in some sense, the stream grinds the corn, yeah. But only, of course, providing the raw physical force that the mechanism needs to perform the task, right? But no latitude of expression would allow us to say, no stretch of conjecture could lead us to think that the stream of water built the mill. Obviously, the mill itself required intellect, required mind, required an intentional, purposive intelligence to contrive the various parts in such a way as to bring about a goal, right? Required intelligent design. What the stream of water does in the affair is neither more nor less than this. By the application of an unintelligent impulse to a mechanism previously arranged independently of it, and arranged by intelligence, an effect is produced. But again, the raw physical force itself, the raw current of the stream, wouldn't itself produce anything so purposive as changing corn into flour. So Paley offers that analogy, and here again finds it implausible that blind random physical forces would just throw together something complex, something so complex as living organic matter. And here again, Paley anticipates this line of argument that has become very characteristic of the Darwinian perspective, that here again, the structure, the organization, the arrangement that we find is not the result of intelligence. It's not the result of design. It's not the result of mind or intellect. It's the result of chance, random forces, random mechanisms such as natural selection. Here again, in any given generation, a certain number of traits are produced, and they all have some genetic basis, and the traits that are not advantageous don't increase the likelihood of survival, simply don't get reproduced, because those members of in any given generation in the history of a species, the natural history of a species, those members don't live long enough to reproduce, so their genes don't get passed on. The traits that are fitness enhancing, the traits that confer some survival advantage, the genes associated with those traits get passed on because those members of the generation live long enough to reproduce. That's basically the Darwinian picture, right? So zebras have stripes for a reason. That helps them evade predators. And leopards have spots for a reason as well. That gives them an advantage over their prey. But Paley is aware that a lot of the ways that things develop, a lot of the ways that things work out in the natural world presuppose some framework of organization. So you look at the way that things happen in the natural world. Oftentimes, Paley understands that oftentimes there seems to be no rhyme or reason to it in any given generation. There are clearly members of a generation that are not well suited to survive. That's not hard to see, and Paley's aware of that. He's aware that when you study the natural world, an awful lot of what you find seems to have no purpose, seems to serve no good end at all, seems to be random. He's aware of that, but he thinks that even the processes by which changes happen in the natural history of species, even those changes where things don't always seem to work out for the best, they all presuppose some background of organization. Here again, even those processes that seem wasteful, that seem to really oftentimes not do any good in terms of conferring some survival advantage, some fitness advantage in a species, even if the process seems not very efficient, even if it seems not very economical, in any given generation, a lot of members of the generation get wiped out, and that's characteristic in the natural history of many species. Here again, I suppose one objection from the other point of view would be, if there is intelligent design, why is there so much of that at the same time? So many members in any given generation don't survive. It seems like those members just ended up being superfluous, just ended up being a waste. Why would an intelligence bring things about in that way? Well, here again, even though Paley is writing before Darwin in the early 19th century, he has an understanding of broadly what would come to be called by Darwin natural selection. And he could just as easily reply that natural selection is itself a kind of mechanism through which design operates. Maybe the intelligent design here again is responsible for such organization as we find, in the sense of laying down the patterns by which things would unfold in the natural world, such as the basic pattern of natural selection that I just laid down. So, even though Paley is writing before Darwin, and Darwin, of course, gives the classic account of natural selection, evolutionary adaptation, and so forth, survival of the fittest, all that. The proponent of the teleological argument, like Paley, can simply reply that that is part of the design. Natural selection could itself be a kind of mechanism through which design operates. So giving a naturalistic account of the mechanism by which order emerges would still leave open to Paley and proponents of the teleological argument generally the reply that the mechanism could not have designed itself. Here again, to Paley's mind, blind random physical forces would not throw together a mechanism as complex and purposive as natural selection either. natural forces act through the mechanism, like the stream driving the mill. So Paley understands that in the natural history of species, in the natural history of the Earth, an awful lot seems to be not very efficient, not very economical in any given generation. Lots of members are wiped out, and looked at from that point of view, it doesn't seem very efficient. Doesn't seem like the way it doesn't seem to follow the way that an intelligence would design things. But here again, the more basic metaphysical question is, why should there be order at all? Here again, there's always more to learn about the way that the patterns, the order in the natural world works. But why should there be order at all is the bigger metaphysical question. There could have just been chaos. There could have just been a physical reality with no structure, no organization to it at all. Why should it be the case that there is any order at all? So even if such mechanisms as we find, say for example natural selection, don't seem to us the way that a divine intelligence would do things, that's still not a decisive objection to the argument, because that still leaves the further question, why should there be organization at all? Why should there be order at all? Why should there be structure or arrangement at all? So again, Paley anticipates many of the objections that one would associate with the Darwinian perspective on things. I said that Paley relies on arguments from analogy. He draws this analogy between an eye on the one hand and a watch on the other hand. We saw him draw this analogy between the force that drives the mill and the role that physical forces play in the picture of the world that the physical sciences give us. And he relies a lot on analogies, and an analogy is a kind of inductive argument. And again, the teleological argument is a kind of inductive argument. I've given an example of a deductive argument earlier when we talked about disjunctive syllogism, right? In the case of disjunctive syllogism, the inferential claim, here again that argument of the form either P or Q, one of those two has to be the case, but P is not the case, therefore Q is necessarily the case. Disjunctive syllogism would be an example of a basic form of deductive inference, and again, deductive inference involves a kind of necessary reasoning. If the premises are true, the conclusion is necessarily true. But of course, that's not the only way that we reason. We also reason inductively. Sometimes we reason from the evidence to what seems like the best inference from the evidence that we have. And we understand that there's a chance that we could be wrong, but we infer what seems like the best explanation given the evidence. That, of course, we reason that way a lot as well. We've seen that Paley relies a lot on arguments from analogy, and an argument from analogy is a kind of inductive argument. What I mean by that generally is that in inductive arguments we attempt to show that some conclusion is probable. In the case of disjunctive syllogism, you're not saying that the conclusion is probable. You're saying that the conclusion follows necessarily. Either P or Q is the case. Either P or Q has to be the case, but P is not the case, therefore Q is necessarily the case. Right? If you're given a disjunctive syllogism, you don't say that the conclusion is probable. But we don't only engage in deductive reasoning. We oftentimes do engage in probabilistic reasoning as well. That's what is meant by inductive reasoning. And there are many forms of argument that are inductive in nature. I've already talked about one, composition inference. A composition inference is always a kind of inductive argument as well. Anytime you're inferring that the parts have some property, therefore the whole will have that property, that's a kind of inductive argument. The fact that the parts have some property is evidence that the whole will have that property, but it doesn't necessarily establish that conclusion. We've seen some examples of composition inferences that are not good, in which the conclusion does not follow. In inductive argument, we attempt to show that some conclusion is probable. So I summarized the argument from design, or the teleological argument, a moment ago, and you will have noticed that the word probably appears in the argument, right? That's because the argument from design is an inductive argument. Here again, human artifacts are products of intelligent design. or purpose. That's uncontroversial. The universe resembles these human artifacts, uncontroversial. Therefore, this is expressing an inference. The universe is probably a product of intelligent design. Obviously, that's a kind of inductive inference. That same evidence, the evidence expressed in statements 1 and 2, would not lead every thinker to the same inference. Some thinkers believe that there's a better inference or a better explanation for those facts than this inference. So it's a probabilistic inference. It's a kind of inductive inference. And of course, oftentimes we reason in a probabilistic way as well. Deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning both play roles in philosophy. So that's just in the nature of inductive reasoning. So it's not a criticism of an inductive argument that the conclusion doesn't follow necessarily, because that is not the inferential claim that one is making when one presents an inductive argument. Because the inferential claim of such an argument is not that the conclusion follows from the premises necessarily. There's no question of the argument being valid or invalid. I said that disjunctive syllogism is a valid form of inference, right? If the premises are true, the conclusion is necessarily true. In the case of inductive arguments, valid or invalid is not the assessment that we make, because it's a kind of probabilistic reasoning. Inductive arguments are strong or weak. Whether the evidence establishes the conclusion or how strongly it establishes some conclusion, that's always a matter of degree. Inductive arguments are relatively strong or relatively weak. Strength and weakness, that's a matter of degree. Valid or invalid is not a matter of degree. A deductive inference is either valid or invalid, all or nothing. In the case of inductive arguments, here again, probabilistic reasoning is a matter of degree, and strength comes in degrees. An inductive argument might be very weak, or it might be very strong. Take the inductive argument, the one lemon that I've tasted was sour, therefore probably all lemons are sour. That would be a weak argument. That would be a generalization. It would be a very weak generalization, because I would be trying to generalize from just a single instance. On the other hand, inductive arguments may be extremely strong. So strong that the conclusion is virtually certain. How about this inductive generalization? Every lemon everyone has ever tasted was sour. Therefore, probably the next lemon to be tasted will be sour. That's also an inductive argument. That's also a generalization specifically. That's a very strong argument. So strength comes in degrees. Take this argument. Teams from the AFC have won three of the last 4 Super Bowls. Therefore, the team from the AFC will probably win the next Super Bowl. So, in presenting an argument like this, of course we always make these kinds of arguments in the context of sports, one isn't claiming that this conclusion follows necessarily. One is claiming that the evidence makes this conclusion probable, right? Teams from the AFC have won 3 of the last 4 Super Bowls, so probably the teams in the AFC that have the best chances of going to the Super Bowl are overall better than the teams from the NFC that have the best chances of going to the Super Bowl. I think most football fans right now, most analysts, most students of the game right now would say that the NFC is probably the stronger conference on the whole. There are more good teams. But the teams from the AFC that tend to go to the Super Bowl in recent years have been teams that tend to beat NFC teams. So this has been a pattern. This has been a trend. It's some evidence. Obviously, it's not decisive, but it's strong evidence for this conclusion. So this would be a kind of prediction. Prediction is also a kind of inductive argument. Here's another example of a generalization. If the evidence for a generalization is not very strong, if it's weak, then that's known as a hasty generalization. So here would be an example of a hasty generalization from a logic textbook. And here again, I gave an example just a moment ago of a generalization that can be very strong. Strength is a matter of degree. It depends on the evidence. After only 1 year, the alternator went out in Mr. O'Grady's new Chevrolet. Mrs. Dodson's Oldsmobile developed a transmission problem after 6 months. The obvious conclusion is that cars made by General Motors are just a pile of junk these days. That would be a weak generalization or a hasty generalization, because it's only 2 instances, and then it's going to a very large category, all cars made by General Motors. So there's really not very much evidence. So that would be an example of a weak inductive argument. We've seen that Paley relies on arguments from analogy. Most importantly, the analogy between a watch, which is unquestionably a product of intelligent design, and an eye, which here again he would infer is very likely, very probably also a product of intelligent design. But of course he doesn't claim that that conclusion follows necessarily. He's just claiming that that is the best inference given the evidence. That is the best explanation for the evidence that we find. Arguments from analogy can be, here again, strong inductive arguments, or they can be weak. It depends on how similar the 2 things being compared are. If the 2 things being compared, the 2 analogs are not very similar, then it's a weak inductive argument. So here are some examples of arguments from analogy, again from Hurley's logic textbook. The operation of a camera is similar in many ways to the operation of an eye. If you're to see anything in a darkened room, the pupils of your eyes must first dilate. Accordingly, if you're to take a photograph in a darkened room, the aperture of the camera lens must first be opened. Okay, so that's an argument from analogy, an argument based on 2 analogs. 2 things are similar. There are some respects in which they're known to be similar, and then one infers that they must be similar in some further respect. That's the structure of analogical reasoning. And we engage in it all the time, and some analogical inferences are strong inferences. That would be an example. That would be a good analogy. There is a very close structural similarity between the eye and the lens of a camera. Not surprisingly here again, because human beings invented cameras by looking at eyes as the model, or camera lenses by looking at the structure of the eye as the model. So not surprising there should be that similarity. And given the structural similarities that we know there are, this is a good inference. The pupil dilates to take in more light. Therefore, it seems like a good inference that the aperture dilates to take in more light, given the structural similarity between the 2 things. So that would be a strong analogy, a good analogy. If the 2 things being compared are not very similar, or they're similar just in certain superficial ways, but there's some really profound differences between the 2 cases, then an analogy is a weak argument. Here's an example of a weak analogy. If a car breaks down on the freeway, a passing mechanic is not obligated to render emergency road service. For similar reasons, if a person suffers a heart attack on the street, a passing physician is not obligated to render emergency medical assistance. Well, the 2 things being compared there are not very similar. I mean, there's a kind of superficial similarity, but there are some profound differences as well, right? If the mechanic doesn't render emergency road service, of course, the car can always be fixed later. But in the case of a person having a heart attack and a physician, that's not true, right? If the physician doesn't render emergency medical assistance, the person may well die, and then there's no question of going back and fixing the person later, so to speak. So there's a serious difference between the 2 cases that undermines the similarities, and that makes that a weak analogy. So one critical thing to think about in assessing the argument from design, the teleological argument, is how good is the analogy? How good are the analogies on which Paley is basing his argument? This is a critical issue. You just have to think about the strength of the analogy. And many philosophers, like Paley, have found the analogy basically a good one. Many philosophers have been critical of it, have argued it's not a good analogy. Here again, strength is a matter of degree. So there's no straightforward answer to this question: is the analogy a good one or not? This is a case where philosophers divide. People generally would divide. And this argument has always had its proponents, but it's always been open to this criticism as well, that the analogy is just weak. So that's one of the critical thinking issues to have in mind when it comes to assessing for yourself this teleological argument or argument from design. I'll conclude by pointing out that many philosophers have here again found the argument from design persuasive, have found it to be an inductively strong argument, but have thought that one has to maybe revise one's conception of God from the traditional conception if the argument is a good one. So I just want to call your attention to a broad kind of philosophical point. As I've said before, these authors that we've been reading, many of them anyway, Aquinas, Samuel Clarke, they're arguing for a fairly specific conception of God. They're arguing for God as conceived in the Judeo-Christian religious tradition. God conceived of as omnipotent, that is to say all-powerful, omniscient, that is to say all-knowing, and supremely good. That is the traditional conception of God in the Judeo-Christian religious tradition, and of course that has been very much intertwined, very much bound up with the Western philosophical tradition. And it's always another possibility, of course, to revise one's concept of God. If one finds that certain of the classic arguments for God don't really establish the God as conceived of by thinkers like Aquinas or Clarke, it's always a possibility that the arguments can be revised in such a way as to establish the existence of maybe God conceived somewhat differently than the traditional way. So I'll just conclude by making this observation. This is another kind of critical thinking issue that one ought to consider when when assessing these classic arguments for the existence of God. John Stuart Mill would be an example with respect to the argument from design, or the teleological argument. John Stuart Mill did find the argument from design persuasive, but he was also an unconventional religious thinker. He did not conceive of God according to the traditional Judeo-Christian religious conception. So Mill did accept the argument from design. He did think the teleological argument was inductively strong, but he thought that what that showed was that God could not be omnipotent. So he had, I think, what many readers would find an unusual, certainly an unconventional conception of God. Not for many readers, this would not be their concept of God, but I just want to call your attention to this logical possibility that with respect to many of these classic arguments for the existence of God, they may not establish God, the existence of God as conceived, traditionally or conventionally, but another possibility, this would be, Mill's thinking would be a case in point, another possibility is to revise one's concept of God in such a way that the argument can establish the existence of God so conceived. So Mill thought that the teleological argument, the argument from design, was correct, was inductively a strong argument, but he thought that that showed that God could not be omnipotent. So he was an unconventional religious thinker, did believe in God, but certainly not a very not a very commonly found conception of God, I guess. In any case, Mill thought the argument is strong, but as he put it, the fact that, well, let me paraphrase just one more time before I read the way that he put it. The fact that God had to use design shows that he had to employ certain means to bringing about the ends that he desired indirectly. And that shows that he couldn't bring about those ends directly, therefore God is not omnipotent. So that is another of the logical possibilities. The way that Mill put the point was to say that the necessity for contrivance, the need of employing means, is a consequence of the limitation of power. The very idea of means implies that the means have an efficacy which the direct action of the being who employs them has not. A man does not use machinery to move his arms. So Mill did believe that the organization that we find in the natural world around us is the product of intelligent design. But that shows that God is not omnipotent. So it's a rather unconventional conception of God. It's a kind of divine intelligence, which here again, as I've mentioned before, is an old idea in philosophy. It goes back many centuries before Christianity to the divine mind of Anaxagoras or the divine mind of Aristotle or Plato. Mill here again would be more in that tradition of conceiving God. A supremely wise, a supremely intelligent being, but one that is not omnipotent and had to use means of bringing about indirectly his goals or his aims. A man doesn't use machinery to move his arms, right? If you can move your arms, you just directly do it. Pretty much everyone can, and so you just directly do it. You don't contrive some machine to move your arms for you. You just directly move your arms. So Mill's point is the fact that God had to use design to bring about his ends means that he couldn't bring about directly, which means that God is not omnipotent. So again, certainly an unusual conception of God, one you probably wouldn't commonly find, but it is one of the possible views on the spectrum of, here again, logically possible views. Mill says that the evidence of natural theology implies that the author of the cosmos worked under limitations. He was obliged to adapt himself to conditions independent of his will and to attain his ends by such arrangements as those conditions admitted of. So I would point out that although the argument from intelligent design has been criticized in many respects, it's always a possibility, and a possibility that I think sometimes is overlooked in the debates between the two sides, that it might well establish God conceived a certain way, but maybe not quite the way that the proponent of the argument from design thinks. So here again, John Stuart Mill, 19th century British philosopher, would be a case in point. Somebody who accepted the basic correctness of the argument, but thought that one's conception of God had to be revised from the traditional conception as a consequence. So just want to call your attention to the fact that that is another of the logical possibilities.